Appreciate y'all tuning in. My name is Jacob Thornton. I am a Christian. I'm a member of the Church of Christ, which is the body of Christ. Romans chapter 16:16 says, the churches of Christ salute you. And 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 20 says, all the brethren greet you. And so what this tells us is that all of the brethren under the New Testament are found in the churches of Christ. And so I want you to be one of the brethren. I want you to become a brother or a sister in Christ. And the way that you do that, as Galatians chapter 3, verse 26 and 27 says, you are all children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have been clothed with Christ, meaning have put on Christ. Now you're a child of God. And that is through faith in Jesus and obedience to him, as Jesus said in Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. So I hope y'all are having a nice morning, hopefully waking up and getting ready to study the scriptures together. Today's topic has to do with the Sabbath day. And this is a topic which receives a lot of attention, but unfortunately it receives a lot of false teachings surrounding it. A lot of individuals say that you have to observe and keep the Sabbath, but those same individuals who say today that you have to observe and keep the Sabbath are involved in so many false doctrines that it should be evident this is just another one of them. Observing the Sabbath under the New Testament is not a true teaching. It's not, as Acts chapter 2, verse 42 says, the Christians were doing. Notice what it says. They continued steadfastly, and the they is those of verse 41, where it says, then they that gladly received his word were baptized. And so under the New Testament, the people, God's people, let me pull up the Bible screen. So you can follow me on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm streaming live to all of those right now. And the Bible program, let me hide that. There you go. In Acts chapter 2, verse 41, they that gladly received his word were baptized. And it says, and so the baptized believers continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. So they were baptized. They began learning from the apostles. And this is what Jesus commanded in the Great Commission, that individuals be baptized and they learn from the apostles, because the apostles would be teaching Jesus's commandments. In the Great Commission, Jesus said, all power is given to him in heaven and in earth. Jesus has all authority. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them. That's Acts chapter 2, verse 41. Those that gladly received his word were baptized. And then what? Well, Acts 2:42 says they continued in the apostles' doctrine. Why would they do that? Well, because Jesus told his apostles to teach the baptized believers to observe everything which Jesus commanded the apostles. And so if an individual wants to follow Jesus, we have to follow the apostles' doctrine. We do not look to the Old Testament for our doctrine in which we obey. The New Testament tells us those things that were written beforehand were written for our learning, but we're not under that time period. We are not under the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. Yesterday's video showed that the first covenant has been done away with and the new covenant is in force. And the Old Covenant lawgiver was Moses, and the children of Israel obeyed Moses. But under the New Testament, God's people obey Jesus Christ. And as revealed in Acts chapter 2, verse 42 again, if an individual wants to obey Jesus Christ, they're going to have to continue steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. And this is just the teachings revealed by the apostles under the New Testament. All of the books in the New Testament, from Matthew to Revelation, contain what we would call teachings of the apostles' doctrine, teachings in which Christians today should obey. One thing that we're going to learn, and again, the topic is the Sabbath day. The Sabbath was introduced in Genesis, where God created the world and everything in it in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. However, there was no commandment for anyone to religiously observe the Sabbath or not work on the Sabbath, right? We have the command for Adam to work and tend the garden, right? God says because Adam sinned, man would have to work the ground in the sweat of his brow. And so man is commanded to work, but man was not commanded to not work on Saturday. That command, not working on the seventh day, not working on the Sabbath to observe it religiously, was not introduced as a teaching for men and women to obey until Israel left Egypt and God gave the law to Moses. Let's see here. In Exodus chapter 20, we can go ahead and read it. A lot of individuals might want a recap to be familiar with what the 10 commandments are. And so this is the law which was delivered to Moses. Here are the 10 commandments. And so if you need to be freshened up on it, we're going to go ahead and read it. God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. This is speaking specifically to the children of Israel. Today, you're not a child of Israel. We're not of their descendants. This was not written to us and our parents. This was written to the Jews and their parents. And this is part of the 10 laws, 10 commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So what would happen is the Gentiles were much involved in this and creating images and calling them gods. It's as if you would chop down a tree, carve an image of a fish out of it, and you'd worship that fish that you just made of wood. And you would say, thank you for creating me and for creating everything. Now, that's just silly because you created that. You created that image, and that image has no life in it. There's no life in that image. And that's what they were doing. They were making images, and they were worshiping that image as if that image created them when really they created it. Now, how silly is that? We think it might be silly, but that's things that they were involved in. And people today are still involved in those kind of practices. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and the fourth generation of them that hate me. So God is willing to punish disobedience, and the effect, the consequences of both the sin and the punishment can last many generations. I mean, you see that even today, if a grandfather gets a DUI, that can affect when he has children, and also when his children has children. And both the sin and the consequences of it, and also the punishment. And so we can see this being true, and that the effects of sin and the consequences last up to multiple generations, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. That's reference to the passers-by who would come join themselves to Israel and enter into covenant. They become what we'd call proselytes, or also called eunuchs. And they were called to observe the Sabbath if they join into covenant with God. And we'll look at that in some of today's scriptures. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. But you notice, up until this time, the commandment to observe the Sabbath has not been introduced. This is the first time that the Sabbath is introduced for men and women on earth to religiously observe. There's no time before this where men and women are commanded to observe the Sabbath. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill, which really should be translated, thou shalt not murder, because murder is premeditated. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor any other thing that is thy neighbor's. And that is the 10 Commandments. And if you notice, the Sabbath day, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That is part of the 10 Commandments. This was the law delivered by Moses to the children of Israel, for the children of Israel. And we're going to jump ahead real quick to the New Testament, and we'll go back to the Old Testament passages. But in the New Testament, they're told to observe the Sabbath. However, under the New Testament, Paul writes to Colossians, who are Gentiles, they're Gentile Christians, and tells them, let no man therefore condemn you in meat or in drink or in respect of a holy day or of a new moon or of the Sabbath days. Under the Old Testament, could you be condemned for not observing the Sabbath day? Yeah. You could be put to death if you were a Jew and didn't observe the Sabbath, because that was the law for Israel. But under the New Testament, are you condemned for not observing the Sabbath day? Not according to Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Well, why? Well, because those things were part of the old law, which was a shadow of the things to come. But the body, the church, right? Ephesians 4:5, there's one body, and this one body, and whether it's members be Jew or Gentile, they share the same law. The body, the church, is of Christ. And the church, the members of the church, do not obey Moses, who introduced a shadow of things to come, but they obey Jesus Christ. And according to Moses, under the old law, the shadow, could you be condemned for not observing the Sabbath if you are a Jew in covenant? Yes, you can. But under the New Testament, now that the body, the church, has been established, can you be condemned for not observing the Sabbath? It says here, let no man therefore condemn you regarding the Sabbaths. And so we're going to go back to the Old Testament. So basically, the Sabbath day was introduced to the children of Israel when the law of Moses was given. It was revealed to Israel, for Israel. And under the New Testament, Christians have no command to observe the Sabbath. That was a law given to Israel, for Israel, just like the law of Moses has plenty of other laws, and which Christians today don't obey. As Hebrews 7:12 says, the priesthood being changed, of necessity, the law is also changed. There's a change also of the law. We're not under the old law. We're under the new law, and there's no new law under the New Testament, which tells us to observe the Sabbath as under the Old Testament. We read under the Old Testament in Exodus 20, it said very clearly to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But under the New Testament, there is no command to do that. It just says, let no man therefore condemn you in the Sabbath days. And so those are two completely opposite teachings. If you wrote this next to Exodus chapter 20, the two would not make sense because they contradict one another. Well, why do they contradict one another? Well, because they're part of two different laws. One law says you have to keep it. The other says you don't. And so if Colossians 2:16 was written under the Old Testament, then we'd have a problem. But because it's written under the New Testament, there is no problem, because the teaching of not observing the Sabbath is not part of the old law. It's part of the new law. If you'd like to call in, I'm live right now. My number is 530-358-0400. You can send a comment and it'll pop up on the screen here and we can address it. In Ezekiel chapter 20. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go over a lot of the verses which have to do with the Sabbath day and who it was for. And so basically what we're going to be seeing in these upcoming verses is that the Sabbath was created for Israel, and it was only revealed to Israel. Wherefore, this is in the Old Testament, God is speaking. Wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. Who is the them? Right, this isn't Gentiles. This is the children of Israel. God brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. God brought the children of Israel into the wilderness. Look what he says. I gave them, who? Well, the children of Israel. I gave them my statutes and shewed them, meaning showed them, my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them. Moreover, also I gave them, who's them? The children of Israel, my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, which is the children of Israel, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. So the Sabbath day was not a commandment between God and mankind. It was not a commandment between God and Adam, or God and Eve, or God and any other offspring. The Sabbath day, it says, was a sign between God and Israel after they were led forth out of the land of Egypt. The Sabbath day, introduced as a religious observance, was not introduced until after the children of Israel left Egypt, and it was only for them. I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them. Now, those today, were your descendants led out of Egypt? Were your physical descendants? No, they're not. No, they weren't. But this Sabbath day then is not for you. You're not even under the Old Testament. We're under the New Testament. And a lot of people just maybe don't see these verses, or when they do see them, they try to explain them a different way. But these verses are pretty clear in that the Sabbath day was for the children of Israel. The Sabbath day was not for Gentiles. It has not existed since the beginning. In all of these verses, we're going to see that the Sabbath day was for the children of Israel, and it was given to them after they left Egypt. And the reason why we're doing this is because individuals today will say that God condemns the person who does not religiously observe the Sabbath day under the New Testament. And that's just not the case. There's no Bible verse for that. And we're going to go over these verses which have to do with the Sabbath. And as stated before, it's for Israel, to Israel. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep. So who was it who was to keep the Sabbath days? The children of Israel. Now, us today, we're Gentiles. We're not Jews. We're Gentiles. And God commanded the Sabbath to be remembered and kept by the children of Israel. God says, For it is a sign between me and you throughout all your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. The Sabbath day was a sign between who? Between God and the children of Israel. And he says here, Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death, for whosoever doth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. And those today who say that the Sabbath is still in effect, you know what they're not going to do? They're not going to put you to death for violating it. Now, if the Sabbath is still in effect, then why is if Exodus 31:13 is still in effect, and so is the first part of 14, why not the rest of 14? Right? Those today say, oh yeah, you shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. But they don't want to keep this part, that everyone that defileth it shall surely be put to death. Now that's just picking and choosing. The old law commanded if you violate the Sabbath and you're a Jew, you need to be put to death. But those today who believe that the Sabbath is still in effect, they're not even wanting to put you to death for violating the Sabbath. And as stated before, one time I worked at Dutch Brothers, and a guy came in and said that I shouldn't be working on the Sabbath. And in my head, I was thinking, I wouldn't have to be working if you didn't come and buy something. So it's hypocritical. It's contradictory, saying you shouldn't be selling today. Well, guess what? You're buying. Why do you think I'm selling? Because you're buying. If you didn't buy anything today, then maybe I wouldn't have to sell anything. And so it's just a hypocrite. But did that guy who said I shouldn't be working on the Sabbath, did he want to put me to death? Probably not. But if I keep the Sabbath, and if I violate the Sabbath, what was the law? That I would be put to death. And so it's just picking and choosing. It's not observing the Sabbath day, because if you observe the Sabbath day, then you would need to observe this commandment also. 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. This was a law for Israel. And to those today who quote this verse, they do not practice it. Wherefore, look what it says. The children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath. Now, why is that? Well, because they were under the Old Testament and the old law was given to them. And so the children of Israel were commanded to keep the Sabbath, not the Gentiles, not anyone else. It was not introduced before that. And it was not introduced as a teaching after the Old Testament ended. The keeping of the law of Moses was only revealed for the children of Israel to keep while they were under the Old Testament. And it says to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And so and when it says forever, basically, because you have other verses, and when it says in the Old Testament, the word forever, that does not always mean forever without end. It just means basically as far as can be seen, because there's commandments given to Aaron and his children forever. However, under the New Testament, the priesthood was changed. And so I think it was in one of the Psalms too. One of the psalmists said that he would serve God in this life forever. However, that just meant until death. And so basically it just means as far as can be seen. And so the Sabbath was a sign for the children of Israel to keep, and in their mind they were to think, okay, there's not going to be we're not going to stop practicing it. However, when the new covenant changed, the law changed and the instructions changed, and they were told that it's no longer a commandment from God under the New Testament. In Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 13 and 14, in all of these verses we're seeing that the command of the Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel and the children of Israel. Thou camest down also upon Mount Sinai, reference to God coming down to Mount Sinai, and spakest with them from heaven, and gavest them right judgments and true laws, good statutes and judgments. And look what it says, and madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath. Was it known yet? It wasn't, not until it was revealed. And commandest them precepts, statutes, and laws by the hand of Moses thy servant. God's command to keep the Sabbath holy was for Israel. God made it known to them when? Well, on the Mount Sinai, when Moses went up and received the tablets and the 10 commandments. That is when the Sabbath was introduced. In Leviticus 26, verses 2 and 3, God says to Israel, to the children of Israel, he says, ye shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If ye walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them. So God commanded the children of Israel to keep his Sabbaths. This wasn't a command for the whole world. This was a command for the children of Israel. Never had it been a command for the whole world to keep the Sabbath. This was a command for the children of Israel who were under the law of Moses. And look at verse 13. I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. And so this is part of the same chapter. And God's speaking to those who he brought out of Egypt. And look what he says, ye shall keep my Sabbaths. Well, who's the ye? Well, it's those who God brought out of the land of Egypt. This is not reference to anyone else. This isn't reference to the Egyptians. This isn't reference to any of the 7 Gentile nations who were living in the land of Canaan. This is for those Israelites that were led out of the land of Egypt. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 6, I mean, these verses are clear as day. And thank God that we have the Bible in order to protect us from the false teachings of men. That if somebody tells you something that the Bible says, that you can pull out your Bible and check for yourself. In Deuteronomy 5:6, it says, I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And you scroll down. So God is speaking to the children of Israel who left Egypt. And look what it says. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Well, who was this revealed to? Who was told to keep the Sabbath day? Well, if we just scroll back up to verse 6, we're going to see who God's talking to. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. That's reference to the Israelites. And so these commandments, this commandment to keep the Sabbath, we're just reading time and time and time again that it was for the children of Israel. It was revealed to the children of Israel. It wasn't revealed before that. It was revealed to them for them. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 22 and 23. Neither carry forth a burden out of your houses on the Sabbath day, neither do ye any work, but hallow ye the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. So who was the command given to? Well, to the first generation of the Israelites that left Egypt. That's who their fathers were. And it says, but they obeyed not, neither inclined their ear, but made their neck stiff, that they might not hear nor receive instruction, so that they were a rebellious generation. However, the command to keep the Sabbath and to keep it holy was a command who? To the fathers of Israel. There was not a command to Adam and Eve or anyone after them until God brought forth Israel out of Egypt and gave them the 10 commandments and other laws. And he delivered them through Moses to Israel for Israel. And under the Old Testament, the only time that Gentiles are seen as keeping the Sabbath is when they would become proselytes. They would become Jewish converts. They would join themselves with the Jewish nation. Now, they still didn't have all the blessings available to the Jews, because if you're a Gentile, even a proselyte, there's some things that you just couldn't do. One of those things was enter into the temple. They had what was it called? An outer court where the Gentiles could go, but the Gentiles could not enter into the temple. And so there's certain things which Gentiles could not do. But if a Gentile wanted to join himself to God, if a Gentile wanted to join themselves to the covenant that God made to the children of Israel, then they could do so. And then they were told to observe the Sabbath in Isaiah chapter 56. And so these passages are found in the Old Testament. And what this tells us is that these passages don't refer to our time period. They refer to the Old Testament time period. And both of these verses, Isaiah 56, and we're going to read Isaiah 66 also, both of these have to do with the children of Israel returning from Babylonian captivity. And what it's seen is that Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians and the surrounding nations. And no one could rebuild Jerusalem unless it was a work from God. And after Jerusalem was destroyed, guess what? The city was rebuilt, the temple was rebuilt, and it was a sign to the surrounding nations that the God of Israel was the true God. And the reason why the true God allowed his people to be destroyed was to punish them for their sins. And then after Babylon punished Jerusalem, then Babylon punished all those surrounding nations, and Babylon itself finally was punished by the Medo-Persians. So the point, though, is that Isaiah 56 is under the Old Testament. It is not a teaching that we observe and teach under the New Testament. And one of the reasons we know why is because look at verse 7. Even to them will I bring to my holy mountain, and to make them joyful in my house of prayer. Now, if you remember and recall Jesus in the gospel accounts, driving out those who were selling merchandise in the temple, he says that the scriptures say that God's temple would be a house of prayer, but they made it a den of thieves. The house of prayer is a reference to the temple. And notice what it says: I will bring them to my holy mountain, reference to Jerusalem in that area, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Now today, God is not going to bring an individual into the temple in Jerusalem. It's been destroyed for almost 2,000 years. And this is an Old Testament teaching. And so we've learned that the commandment for the Sabbath was to Israel, for Israel, wasn't given before the children of Israel. And it's not a commandment under the New Testament. It was for them specifically under the Old Testament. And under the Old Testament, if a Gentile wanted to join themselves with the Jews and enter into this covenant, they would have to then observe the Sabbath. But no command was given to the Gentiles no command was given to the Gentiles who didn't join themselves to the Jewish nation to keep the Sabbath. Look what it says. This is regarding when the children of Israel returned from Babylonian captivity. Thus saith the Lord, keep ye judgment and do justice, for my salvation is near to come and my righteousness to be revealed. Reference to God bringing back the children of Israel from Babylonian captivity. Blessed is the man that doeth this, and the son of man that layeth hold on it, that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and keepeth his hand from doing any evil. This is under the Old Testament. Neither let the son of the stranger that hath joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord hath utterly separated me from his people. Neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. And so this is the idea that after the Jews returned to Jerusalem, that Gentiles would join themselves with the Jews under the Old Testament. And it says, for thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths, and choose the things that please me, and take hold of my covenant, even unto them will I give in mine house, and within my walls a place and a name better than of sons and of daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. And the sons of the strangers that join themselves to the Lord to serve him, and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it, and taketh hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. This is an Old Testament teaching. These individuals, once the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity, the Gentiles would come and join themselves with the Jews. And it says that God would bring even those Gentiles who desired to serve them, they would bring them to his house of prayer, which is a reference to the temple. For mine house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. This is a reference to the temple that was in Jerusalem. This is not a teaching for today. And so individuals who pull up this verse in Isaiah 56 saying, look, it says to keep the Sabbath. Well, it also says that God's temple would be standing, and God's temple in Jerusalem is not standing. This is an Old Testament teaching, and it's limited by this to that time period. It's under the old law. It's not a new covenant law teaching. Same thing with Isaiah chapter 66 at the very end. This again has to do with God destroying Jerusalem using Babylon, and the Jews went into captivity for 70 years. After 70 years, they would return from captivity to Jerusalem. And at that time, the Gentiles are pictured as joining the Jews in the covenant and becoming proselytes and serving God. As stated before, when God punished Jerusalem, all the nations surrounding Jerusalem were like, their God is not the true God because look, they're being punished. Well, Jerusalem was destroyed. They didn't think it could be rebuilt. Those nations were actually punished afterwards. And then the city of Jerusalem and its temple was rebuilt. And that was a sign to the surrounding nations that the God of Israel is the true God. And once they seen that, once they seen Jerusalem destroyed, then themselves destroyed, and Jerusalem rebuilt and themselves still destroyed, they would recognize the God of Israel as the true God, and they would join themselves in covenant as proselytes. And it says, let's see, it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, this is reference to once they return from Babylonian captivity, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And so this is the idea under the Old Testament, right? New moons and Sabbaths, all flesh would come to worship before the Lord, which is a reference also to Gentiles, but a reference to the Gentiles who would come and join themselves to the Jews and enter into covenant. Now you have this verse, and this might be one of the reasons, very possibly could be one of the reasons in Colossians 2, verse 16, where you have false teachers who were commanding Christians under the new covenant to observe new moons and Sabbaths. Well, look what it says. Under the Old Testament, it says that that's what all flesh would do, observe new moons and Sabbaths. However, this is limited to the Old Testament. This does not mean that for all time until the end of the world that Gentiles should observe new moons and Sabbaths. This means as long as the Old Covenant was enforced. You have this verse here, and just notice the difference. This verse says that Gentiles would keep new moons and the Sabbaths. Well, Colossians 2:16. Let no man therefore judge you, meaning condemn you, in respect of a holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbaths. Well, we just read in Isaiah 66 that all flesh, including Gentiles, would observe these. But now they're not. How is that possible? Isaiah 66 says they would observe the new moon and Sabbath, and Colossians 2:16 says that they wouldn't, it's not a command. Well, that's because Isaiah 66 is part of the old covenant. Once the new covenant came into effect, the teachings changed. And so those passages which people are using, they're twisting those scriptures. And it's sad to see, but if you have a Bible and you're watching this, take notes. Remember these things, because this is how you combat those teachings. Isaiah 56 and Isaiah 66 are confined and limited to the Old Testament. And some of the reasons why, you might wonder, why were the Gentiles, if it wasn't a command for non-Israelites, then why were the non-Israelites commanded to observe the Sabbath when they joined themselves with the Jews? Well, because it was a command for the Jews under their covenant, under their law. And if a Gentile who didn't keep the Sabbath joined themselves to the Jews who did keep the Sabbath, well, that Gentile who didn't keep the Sabbath would influence those Jews who did not to keep it. If you have someone around you doing something that you're not doing, or doing something that you shouldn't be doing, it's going to influence you to do what they're doing. So we have Lori. I appreciate the comment. Does all flesh mean Gentiles too, or all flesh who belong to God? The Gentiles were not under the law of new moons and Sabbaths. How could they observe these things by law? Right. And so I don't know if you missed it in Isaiah 56. And so the picture is this. God punished Jerusalem using Babylon. This was during the Old Testament time period. God punished Jerusalem using Babylon. Jerusalem fell. The surrounding nations were afterwards punished, and Israel returned home from captivity, and it was a sign to all the surrounding nations that the God of Israel was the true God. And I'm going to have to pull up the verses, but it pictures all of the world being punished, and the remnant, including the Gentiles who weren't punished, it pictures them as serving God. So the judgment which occurred when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, then Babylon punished the surrounding nations, then Babylon finally was punished by Medo-Persia, is pictured as God refining the earth to get rid of all the wicked, so that way only the righteous remain. That's the picture under the Old Testament. And yeah, Isaiah 56, we read this passage where it says, this is a reference to the return from Babylonian captivity. And it says, my salvation is near to come, my righteousness to be revealed. That's a reference to when the Jews would be released from Babylonian captivity. And it says, that the son of the stranger could join himself to the Lord, which is a reference, the stranger is the Gentile. So the son of the Gentiles can join himself to the Lord. And thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbath and choose the things that please me, take hold of my covenant. So let me see. Also the sons of the strangers that join themselves to the Lord. Again, this is pictured after the return from Babylonian captivity. The sons of the strangers, right? Here's Gentiles that join themselves to the Lord. So Jerusalem was destroyed and then rebuilt, and that would cause the surrounding nations to realize, wow, the God of Israel is the true God. I want to serve him. And they would join themselves to the children of Israel to serve him, to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants. Everyone that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it and taketh hold of my covenant. And so they were told to keep the Sabbath if they joined the Jews and served God according to the Old Testament. That'd be what we call proselytes. And so, let me see. Let me try to find this passage. So this again has to do with Jerusalem being punished and the return of the Jews from Babylonian captivity, and the surrounding nations would see that the God of Israel is the true God, because how could a city be destroyed with that great of a destruction and then rebuilt? And it was told beforehand that that's what would happen. And so it says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, it shall yet come to pass that there shall come people and the inhabitants of many cities. So this is when Jerusalem would be rebuilt and restored after being destroyed by Babylon. And the inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, and so this is Gentiles. So when Jerusalem was rebuilt, the inhabitants of these Gentile cities would go to one another, saying, let us go speedily to pray before the Lord and to seek the Lord of hosts. I will go also. So you have this agreement among the Gentiles to go to Jerusalem and seek the Lord. And it says, yeah, many people and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to pray before the Lord. And so it's the idea that after Babylonian punishment, that the nations would realize that God was the God of the earth, the God of Israel was the God of the earth. And it says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt that is him, that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And so this is the idea of a proselyte. And so when they did this, when they said, we'll go with you, right? We've heard that God is with you. Well, then they would have joined themselves with them, as Isaiah 56 says, and they would be commanded, since they joined themselves, to observe the Sabbath. And it was told too, if they even violated the Sabbath and they joined into covenant with God, with the Jews as a proselyte, that they would be put to death. So under the New Testament, though, there is no law. There's no law for converts to keep the old law. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 23 through 25, the old law ends when the faith came, which was the day of Pentecost. No longer are individuals being converted to that old law, but individuals are being converted to the new law, which is the law of faith. But before faith came, right, before the New Testament came, we were kept under the law, meaning we were kept under the Old Testament, shut up until the faith, meaning sealed up until the faith, which should afterwards be revealed. It's just saying that the faith would be revealed after the law. All this is saying is that the second covenant would be revealed after the first covenant. Wherefore the law, meaning the Old Testament, was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith is come, right, the New Testament came. Since the New Testament came, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. And so individuals trying to justify keeping the Sabbath day and going to all these Old Testament passages, we're not under the schoolmaster. We're not under the law. Otherwise, are you going to go to Jerusalem, right? Isn't that where it said that they would go? They would go to Jerusalem to keep the Sabbaths and to worship. Today, those people who say to keep the Sabbath aren't going to Jerusalem. It's just picking and choosing. And so under the old law, they were commanded those things, but not under the new law. And as stated before, under the Old Testament, if you violated the law of Moses, there was a death penalty. Exodus 20, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And we are told, okay, this isn't the passage. Well, we read the passage earlier, but this isn't it, where it said that if you violate the Sabbath, you're going to be commanded to be put to death. Well, 31:15 says 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Those today who tell you to keep the Sabbath, are they going to put you to death for violating the Sabbath? No. Well, why not? What changed, right? Where in the New Testament, if under the New Testament, if we're commanded to keep the Sabbath, right, because the old law said so, where did it change that the individual who violates the Sabbath is not going to be put to death? Where did that teaching change, right? If individuals who are adamant saying that the Sabbath law, the Sabbath day is still to be observed, when was this teaching changed so that we don't have to observe this? I mean, you don't see individuals who violate the Sabbath being put to death. And so it's just picking and choosing, as stated before. Colossians 2:16 and 17. And you notice here, is there condemnation for violating the Sabbath? He shall be put to death. Can you be condemned under the Old Testament for violating the Sabbath? Yes, you can. What about the New Testament? Let no man therefore judge you. And the word judge means condemn. Let no one condemn you of the new moon or of the Sabbath days. Why? Because those things are part of the old law, which is a shadow of things to come. But the body, meaning the church, right? The church is the body. The church is of Christ. The church does not obey the old law, does not obey Moses, because the members of the church are not under the old law. The members of the church are under faith, as Galatians chapter 3 says. The members of the church are under the law of faith and therefore obey Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ has no commandment for the members of his body to observe the Sabbath days. And we just read, there's a complete contradiction. And as stated before, if this verse, Colossians 2:16, if this verse was written under the Old Testament, there would be a contradiction, right? That would be a problem. The Old Testament condemns the person who does not observe the Sabbath. And the New Testament says there's no condemnation for the person who doesn't observe the Sabbath. It's two different rules. Well, why? Because it's part of two different laws. One law says to keep the Sabbath. The other one says you don't have to. It's not part of that law. If someone wants to call in, it's 530-358-0400. And I do appreciate that comment. Yeah, the Old Testament, all flesh does mean Gentiles also. And just like in Acts chapter 2, regarding the promise of the Holy Spirit, the ability to do miracles, it shall come to pass in the last day, saith God, I will pour out of my spirit upon all flesh. And all flesh is a reference to Jew and Gentile. It doesn't mean every single person of God's creation. And we could just do a search on that. All flesh, right? God looked upon the earth and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had been corrupted, had corrupted his ways upon the earth. So sometimes all flesh does mean every person, but this is before the law of Moses was introduced. So this is not when there was a distinction between Jew and Gentile. So if we look after the law of Moses was introduced, all flesh, let's see. Usually I do studies on this before I bring it up, but Isaiah 40 verse 5, reference to Jew and Gentile. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. And this here is about Jesus, John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. And really, basically, under the Old Testament, this passage, immediately the context has to do with them returning from Babylonian captivity and all flesh seeing the salvation that God gave to Israel. Isaiah 66:23, and it says, it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. And so all flesh, as stated before, it does mean Jew and Gentile, but the world was pictured as being refined in order that all the wicked might be purged out, so that only the righteous remained, and the remnant that remained would come and worship the Lord. But it said they would observe new moons and Sabbaths, and by the time the New Testament was written, they wouldn't observe new moons and Sabbaths. And so this was an Old Testament teaching that was fulfilled under the Old Testament. By the time Jesus died on the cross and the church was established, this is not something which Christians were to look forward to. This was in their past. This is part of the Old Testament. So Isaiah 66:23 is not a teaching which we practice or a teaching which we are looking forward to. It's in our past. The question is, when was the law, including the Sabbath, abolished? And we have two different places that tell us, at least two different places. And it's pictured as being nailed to the cross of Christ, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Where was the old law removed? At the cross of Christ. And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Jesus overcame the principalities and powers. Jesus has victory. And let's see, over the principalities and powers that condemned him. And Jesus, having ascended into heaven, has all authority. But notice what it says. Jesus blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. He nailed it to the cross. And so because it was nailed to the cross, look what it says. Let no man therefore condemn you. All of these teachings were part of the Old Testament law, where you observe religiously food and drink and holy days and new moons and Sabbaths. But because Jesus nailed that law to the cross, and that's what it's saying, look what it says. Jesus blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, nailing it to the cross. Let no man therefore, what's the therefore? Well, our evangelist always says in the congregation, what is the therefore? Therefore, right? It's pointing back to what was just stated. And so because the handwriting of ordinances was nailed to the cross, therefore, no one can condemn us, because that law is no longer in effect, but the body, the church, is of Christ. We have a new lawgiver. We don't obey Moses. We obey Jesus Christ. Ephesians chapter 2 also says the same thing. Jesus is our peace, who hath made both one, Jew and Gentile. He hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us, which is a reference to the law given to Israel by Moses. He has abolished in his flesh the enmity. And what is the enmity between Jew and Gentile? Well, it's the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain, meaning of two, one new man, so making peace. Jesus abolished the law. How? In his flesh. Well, what happened to his flesh? It was nailed to the cross, as Colossians chapter 2 says, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. And it also says and came and preached peace to you which were far off, which is reference to Gentiles, and to them which were nigh, which is reference to Jews. And so it shows this peace, which it just explained, between the Jew and the Gentile, this peace between those who were far off, which is Gentiles, and to those who were near, which is reference to Jews. And it says, when was this abolished? When was this peace established? When is it pictured as being established? Well, when the enmity, the law of commandments, was removed, which it says it was abolished where? In his flesh. And that's reference to Jesus's death on the cross as stated in Colossians chapter 2. Today, we are under a new law. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12. For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. The law was changed. So, can you understand why the Old Testament condemns you for not observing the Sabbath, but the New Testament does not condemn you? Because it's different laws. It's not the same law. We're under today the law of Christ, which is also called the law of faith. No Gentiles under the New Testament were ever commanded to observe the Sabbath, but rather the opposite. In Colossians chapter 2, we read that it said to the Gentile Christians, let no man condemn you regarding the new moons and the Sabbaths. Under the New Testament, this is what, those who are of Seventh-day Adventists, I think even it's a group called the Black Hebrew Israelites. There's some other individuals too who say that this teaching of the law is still in place. However, it says here there is a changing of the law, and under the New Testament, there is no command to Gentiles. And so when I say under the New Testament, I mean after Jesus ascended into heaven. You might ask, why did Jesus keep the Sabbath? Well, because he was a Jew and he was born under the law, as Galatians chapter 4 says. No Christian under the new law, right after the law had been changed, no Christian under the new law was commanded to observe the Sabbath, but rather the opposite. Colossians 2 says, let no man condemn you regarding the Sabbath. In the book of Romans, it does mention one individual can observe a day to the Lord. So, for example, if you were a Jew and you observed the Sabbath day under the Old Testament and you were alive when Jesus was living, well, then Jesus died. He rose again 3 days later. He walked the earth for 40 days. And then the law was given in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, the new law, through the apostles. And now the apostles, so just 53 days previous, the command was for you to keep the Sabbath. And now that the law was changed, the apostles are teaching you don't have to keep the Sabbath. Well, what do? Are you able to keep the Sabbath if you want to? Yes, you could. But what you can't do is tell someone else that they have to keep the Sabbath. If you wanted to keep the Sabbath, you could, but you couldn't tell anyone else that they should. And so it was between the individual and the Lord. And that's what, I don't have the verse up here. It's in Romans. Romans 14:6. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. Do you have to regard the day? No, you don't. But can you? Yes, you can. He that eateth to the Lord, he that eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks, and he that eateth not to the Lord, he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. So this is the idea. If you're eating and you're giving God thanks, if you're eating meat, and under the Old Testament, some individuals didn't eat meat. Well, and the reason why is because it was part of their law. Well, once the law changed, some individuals had a problem with eating meat because for their whole life, they were trained and conditioned to believe that eating meat is wrong. And now that the new law came into effect, even though they could eat meat, they didn't want to. Well, they don't have to. But you can't teach someone else that they can't just because you don't want to. It's lawful for someone else too. Was it lawful under the New Testament for the Jews to observe the Sabbath? Yes, it was. But was it lawful for the Jews under the New Testament to tell someone else, even another Jew, that they had to observe the Sabbath? No, it's not. It's written to Peter. What is the verse where Paul confronts Peter and says, you're living after the way of the Gentiles because he himself wasn't following the law. Galatians 2:14. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou being a Jew livest after the manner of Gentiles and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? So Peter himself was a Jew who observed the law of Moses during the time of the Old Testament, but the New Testament came into effect and it's no longer a law to observe the Sabbath. So what's Peter doing? Well, he's not observing. He's not doing the things which the Jews were doing. He's living after the manner of the Gentiles. The Gentiles did not observe the law of Moses. And so Peter is, what is the word? Exercising his freedom under the new law. He's exercising his freedom from the old law, and he's not practicing it, but he's just practicing New Testament Christianity. Can a person today observe the Sabbath and still be right with God, or would that be mixing old law with new law? So Romans 14 was written during the time period these individuals were alive before the transition. And once the transition took place from the old law to the new law, they were still alive, and so they were having trouble. This is, I believe, written for Jews, but it doesn't say here that the Jew that regardeth the day to the Lord regardeth it. Hold on. It doesn't say here the Jew that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord. It says he. So this could be Gentile. However, we read, is it Galatians? Is it 4? So this is written to Christians, and it says, but now, after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? Ye observe days and months and times and years. So what happened here, the problem wasn't necessarily that they were observing these days, but it's that they were observing them as if it was necessary for their salvation. Because we just read in Romans chapter 14, is it a problem if an individual observes a day to the Lord? No, it's not. So then what's the problem here that these individuals are observing days? Well, they are desiring again to be in bondage. And Galatians chapter 5 tells us that it says here, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. So would I think that Christians today should observe the Sabbath? There's no command for it. So I don't know where these Christians would get that idea that God is pleased with them not working on a Sabbath under the New Testament. I mean, you can work on a Sabbath, you cannot work on a Sabbath. It doesn't condemn you, and it doesn't save you if you work or if you don't. And so the New Testament tells us not to be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And so I would say, I would not recommend, because you would ask a person, why are you observing the Sabbath day? And they say, well, because the old law says to. But the New Testament tells us, Christ is become of no effect unto you, whosoever of you are justified by the law. But then you have the Jews under the New Testament who were observing the law, but that's because it was their tradition. And the Jews observing the Sabbath under the New Testament, those who were Christians, were not telling Gentiles to observe the Sabbath. And those who did, those Jews under the New Testament who were telling Gentiles to observe the Sabbath were actually helping condemn those Gentiles for observing those days, times, and years. So did Paul recommend teaching other individuals to observe days, months, times, and years? According to this, no. Right? Where do individuals get the teachings to observe days, months, times, and years? Well, that would have been from the Old Testament law, but we're not told to observe those traditions found under the Old Testament law, but we are told, just as the Thessalonians, to observe the traditions given to us by the apostles. I hope that wasn't confusing. Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you have been taught, whether by word or by our epistle. And so we're called to hold the traditions of the New Testament and not the traditions of the Old Testament. I hope that wasn't confusing. The question was, can a person today observe the Sabbath and still be right with God? The New Testament tells us not to observe days, months, years in the sense of religiously. And every time that a Gentile did observe it, it's because someone from the old law told them to, and Paul wrote to them telling them not to. So, I mean, can a person observe a day? I don't know necessarily the Sabbath, but can a person observe a day and still be right with God? Well, I think that they can. Romans 14:4, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth? Yeah, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. And the reason surrounding this context has to do with observing one day above another. Another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. But as stated before, this was because those Jews were transitioning. They transitioned from the old law to the new law. So in their mind, there was a day more important than another one. And it says here that the person who regarded the day and the person who did not regard the day, both of them would be saved. But you had Gentiles who didn't keep the law, who became Christians and began observing ordinances from the law. And Paul writes to them saying, what are you doing? So that's all have to do more study on that, because individuals today do try to observe the Sabbath. But what does that mean? Because if you observe the Sabbath and say in your mind that you observe the Sabbath, well, the old law said if you violate the Sabbath, then you would be put to death for that. And so would you then condemn yourself? But it's not a law under the New Testament not to work. So in your mind, did you just condemn yourself where there is no law because you made a law for yourself? And so, I mean, you would run into some trouble with that. But maybe I'll be able to answer that more on tomorrow's. What I know is that the Sabbath was given to the children of Israel, and it was not given to Gentiles. And under the New Testament, we have no command to observe the Sabbath. And it says here that you can esteem one day above another, but when a person says they want to observe the Sabbath day, now they're going back to the old law. And Paul writes to us, to Gentiles, and says not to go back to the old law. So that's a good question. That's something, I guess, that we have to be careful with. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty, the freedom wherewith Christ hath made us free. Christ made us free from that old law. Be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And so all of the old law is pictured as a yoke of bondage because there's no forgiveness under that old law. It had the shedding of animal blood. So we're called to obey the New Testament where the blood of Christ is available. And in this case, it was them being circumcised. And you had, who was it that was circumcised? It wasn't Titus. I guess Titus wasn't circumcised. Was it Timothy? Timothy was circumcised? I think it was Timothy. And so was Timothy circumcised? That's part of the old law. Was he circumcised to be saved? No. But was he circumcised for expediency, that he might be able to reach more Jews? Yes. So even though circumcision was part of the old law, was it lawful for him to do it knowing that it had nothing to do with his own salvation? Yeah, he could, because he wasn't being circumcised to be saved. He wasn't observing that for his own salvation, but it was used as an expediency to reach others. And so the question is, well, the law also included the Sabbath. Can you observe the Sabbath? if you're doing it in a way knowing that you don't have to, right? Timothy didn't have to be circumcised. He could if he wanted to. He didn't have to because it has nothing to do with his salvation. Observing the Sabbath, does that have something to do with your salvation? Well, it says in Romans 14, you can esteem one day above another. But I guess the problem comes when you begin observing that day as if you have to. Now, there is a day in which Christians are commanded to observe that they have to, and that's the first day of the week when the Christians assemble together. And Hebrews chapter 10 tells us if we forsake that assembly, right, if we forsake that day of the week, then there is no hope of eternal life. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Today I felt was a good study. There's a lot more that I have to go over regarding the Sabbath. I guess we can try to go through some of it. In the New Testament, Paul and the other Jewish Christians were going on Sabbath days into synagogues and teaching them. Why were they? Why were Paul and the apostles and other Jewish Christians teaching in synagogues on Sabbaths? Was it because that they felt that they had to? No, it was in a sense used in expediency because they knew that if they went to a synagogue on the Sabbath, they would be able to teach individuals. And that's all the cases you look at when Christianity began in the book of Acts and they went into the synagogues on the Sabbath. It wasn't to worship with them as if they were still bound under that old law, but it was to teach them about the new law. Galatians 4:21-31 explains why we shouldn't obey the old law. Even the Jews understood that they were of the slave woman, and we who follow Christ were of the free woman. Right. Yeah, I agree with that. We should not obey the old law. I mean, in Galatians 4 has the comparison between the old law, the slave woman, and the mother, which is from above, which is the free woman, and we're part of the free woman, not the slave woman. So we should not obey those old laws. We should obey the new laws. Right. I would agree. And those today who tell you to observe the Sabbath. And so this is the thing. I've never heard a Christian tell me to observe the Sabbath. And maybe that's why I was thrown off on the question a little bit is, can we today be saved by in observing the Sabbath? Because I've never had a Christian tell me to observe the Sabbath. The only people who tell me to observe the Sabbath are Seventh-day Adventists. And they tell me if I don't observe the Sabbath, that I'm going to be condemned. And that's exactly the type of attitude which Paul writes these Gentile Christians and condemns. That you can't condemn someone for something that's not written in the scriptures regarding Colossians 2:16 says, let no one condemn you in the Sabbath. Right? You're not practicing it. Don't let anyone condemn you for not practicing it. And those today have that same spirit of the false teachers, and they'll condemn you for not keeping a Sabbath. And the only people who have told me to keep the Sabbath are Seventh-day Adventists. And even if you join sides with the Seventh-day Adventists, you're going to have to accept other false teachings like babies born sinners. You're going to have to accept the teaching that Michael is not, or that Jesus is not divine, but that Jesus is the Archangel Michael. If you join yourselves to the Seventh-day Adventists, you're also going to have to accept Ellen G. White as a prophet and accept her writings and her teachings. And so those who say to keep the Sabbath, if you join sides with them, you're going to have to accept a whole lot more error. And so would I recommend a person keeping the Sabbath? Would I tell someone who is a Christian to observe the Sabbath? No, I would not. If they asked me if I would observe the Sabbath day, I would say, no, I would not. And in their mind, I mean, in my mind, do I have any reason to observe the Sabbath day? No, I do not. I'm not under the old law. I'm under the new law. Those who have left the SDA organization have a difficult time leaving the Sabbath law. What should be our attitude with them? Love and kindness. And as 2 Timothy says, not striving, not argumentative. Let me see. I think it's 2 Timothy chapter 2. The servant of the Lord must not strive, but be gentle unto all, able to teach, patient. And so I think that, as stated in this video, what a person has to do is, because how did they find out about that teaching of the Sabbath law? Well, it was through false teachers imposing a commandment on them which should have never been imposed. And so they're going to have to realize from the scriptures that that Sabbath law was not given to Gentiles. It's not a commandment under the New Testament. It was only for the children of Israel, right? Between a sign of the children of Israel and God. And are you asking if someone in the SDA organization, see, I don't even know exactly, because under the Old Testament, observing the Sabbath had to do with more than just not working, right? It had to do with them being in the land of Israel. And about, you couldn't go through the field and harvest, but you could go through the field and pluck the corn with your hand and eat it. And so the law regarding the Sabbath had to do with more than just simply not working, but it had to do with them being in the promised land. And so the question would be, I would say to a person, that's not a law for you to obey. And it should not make a person feel condemned if they don't observe it, because it's not a law. It never was for the Christian. And hopefully through a lot of Bible study, right? A lot of gentle Bible study where you're patient with them, hopefully you can instruct them, right? Instruct those that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil. And so those who teach that the commandment to keep the Sabbath is still in effect are in the snare of the devil. That's a teaching from the devil. That's not a teaching from God. And so, I guess I won't really, basically, would I recommend someone to keep the Sabbath? No, I wouldn't. It's not part of the new covenant law. I want to keep the traditions of the apostles and the prophets of the New Testament. And so I would not recommend a Gentile today keeping the law, any part of it, because we're under a new law. Maybe someone else has some different thoughts. Maybe they want to call in 530-358-0400, or they would like to leave a comment about that. But I just know the only people telling me to keep the Sabbath are those part of the Seventh-day Adventist organization. And I've heard others also. But if you accept that teaching from them, like I said, you're going to have to accept a lot more error from their organization, such as Jesus being the Archangel Michael, which he isn't. And also you would have to accept Ellen G. White as a prophet, which she wasn't, and she's not. And you'd have to accept her writings as being inspired from God, which they're not. You're going to have to accept the dreams and the visions which she claimed that she had, which she never did. They weren't from God. But yeah, Romans 14, I haven't done a whole lot of study. Like individuals say, well, Romans 14 talks about observing a day, and then they bring up Christmas or Easter as if, it's okay for them to observe that day religiously. And that's just something I haven't got into a whole lot of study for. But I think what this has to do with those under the old law who had these commandments for them, and the new law came into effect, and some still held to those traditions of the old law because they were under them for their whole life, and others had no problem leaving them. Now, for those who were under that old law and became Christians, and if the old law said not to eat certain meat, and under the new law, you can eat that meat, but you didn't want to, you don't have to. Eating that meat doesn't save you. If you eat that meat, it doesn't save you. If you don't eat that meat, it doesn't save you, right? You have freedom. But regarding the Sabbath, there's no command under the New Testament. So would I recommend it that someone keeps it? No, I wouldn't. I couldn't. I can't. and then no one can recommend to me that I should keep it and observe it also. That is going back to the old law, actually. You're observing something which was never meant for you to observe. You're a Gentile, right? That's the children of Israel. So I might ask the person who's keeping the Sabbath, who's a Gentile, what are you doing? Why are you keeping that? It wasn't for you, right? This is another, and those who are part of the Seventh-day Adventists and other churches that say you have to keep the Sabbath, they're Gentiles just like me. And where in the New Testament, because if it's a commandment to keep the Sabbath, where in the New Testament, if you're commanded to keep the Sabbath and you're a Gentile, well, then I'm commanded to keep the Sabbath too, and I'm a Gentile. But that's not the case. Gentiles are not commanded to keep the Sabbath. And because I'm not, I'm going to try to persuade you that you're not commanded to do that either. Let's see. Well, I appreciate y'all tuning in. There's a lot more to go over here. I have quite a few more verses. Maybe we can pick this up tomorrow. So I think that's what we'll do. Is today we'll end the video here, and tomorrow we will pick up regarding the Sabbath, and maybe I can answer that question a little better regarding, a person who desires to keep the Sabbath day. I'll do some studying from the scriptures, and I will study that, and I'll bring it up tomorrow. And basically, I'm not the smartest guy there is. I know quite a bit of scripture, but I know only what I've studied about. There's things which I haven't studied, and if someone asks me a question and if I don't know the answer completely, well, I'm going to study that and I'll get back to you. So I'll study that tomorrow or tonight, and I'll post it in a video tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, the lesson will be finishing this regarding the Sabbath, but also it will regard the first day of the week and why it's important to Christians. And so under the old law, the important day was Saturday, but under the new law, right, it's a different law. The important day is the first day of the week. Mark 2:27, that's the scripture used for New Testament observance of the Sabbath. Okay, well, we can go there real quick. I got a little bit of time. I just have way too much material to finish. So, I got a little time, but I got too much material for a little time. He said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Well, if that's the case, if this means that an individual must keep the Sabbath, and that's for all humans, well, why was it introduced only when the children of Israel left Egypt? Right? This verse, they have a saying, that which proves too much proves too little. If this verse is teaching that it was God's commandment since the beginning of the world for all men and women to observe the Sabbath, why was it a sign? How could it be said that it's a sign between God and Israel, where he said the Sabbath is a sign between you and me? Right? If the Sabbath was a sign between God and everybody, how could God say it's a sign between you and me? Well, that tells us that no one observed the Sabbath until Israel left Egypt. And so if they use this verse to say that the Sabbath is a day for all mankind to obey, well, that it just won't work, because no one observed the Sabbath until the children of Israel left Egypt. And also, if individuals say Mark 2:27 will condemn a person for not observing the Sabbath, look what Colossians 2:16 says. Let no man therefore condemn you regarding the Sabbath. Right? So either there's a contradiction or there's a misunderstanding. And I think there's a misunderstanding. And I don't think Mark 2:27 can be used to say that mankind from beginning to end is called to observe the Sabbath day, because here, Colossians 2:16, look what it says. Let no one condemn you regarding a Sabbath. And so individuals are going to Mark 2:27 to show you you're condemned for not observing the Sabbath. And here we have writings from the apostles themselves, right? Acts 2:42 says the baptized believers continued in the apostles' doctrine. Well, the apostles' doctrine says you're not condemned if you don't observe the Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that you better stop listening to those people who are condemning you for observing the Sabbath, or for not observing the Sabbath. It's part of the old law, right? They're part of the shadow of the things to come. Right, yeah. And what is a person, what are they doing observing the shadow of the things to come? The body is of Christ. The church is of Christ. The church obeys Jesus Christ. So what is a person? What are they doing observing the shadow of the things to come? That's the shadow. Why are you observing the shadow when the body is now here? The church is now here. Yeah, so I'll answer that question more tomorrow morning, and I appreciate it. And, sometimes when I get done with the program, I think, maybe I said something wrong, or I wish I wouldn't have said that, but it's a learning process. And I appreciate everyone for tuning in and making this opportunity, making this happen, and for asking questions and for allowing the community to see the scriptures on the screen. I appreciate everyone for their questions and their comments, and for the phone calls I do have. I was supposed to have someone from Indiana calling this morning, but he said he was having some work done on his vehicle, so maybe tomorrow he can call in. I'll get a hold of him and let him know maybe to call in tomorrow, because we're going to continue the subject on the Sabbath. And tomorrow also we'll introduce the first day of the week, which is Sunday, and why Christians observe the first day of the week. I appreciate that. Lori says, you're doing a great job. Don't doubt yourself. Right. Well, it's just, sometimes you examine your performance and you see, I could have done better. I could have said something better. Maybe I shouldn't have said this, right? Controlling your tongue is something not easy to do. It's a little bit hard. And so sometimes you say stuff that you wish you wouldn't have said. Sometimes, what's it say? A wise man, I don't even know the saying. See, basically, even a fool looks smart if he doesn't say anything. And so sometimes it's best to say less words than more words. But yeah, this has been a good study. The only thing in which I'm going to continue on tomorrow is regarding that question. What would I say to the person who observes the Sabbath under the New Testament but says you don't have to, but I do? Right? I think that's what, if that's right, I think that's the question being asked is, if someone today says, I observe the Sabbath, you don't have to, I don't impose it upon anyone else. They say, I don't observe the Sabbath for salvation, right? I just observe it. Well, they wouldn't fall into this category of condemning you for observing the Sabbath, and they wouldn't teach you to observe the Sabbath. So, yeah, in my head, the individual, if they want to observe a Sabbath day and not work on a Saturday and just, devote it to Bible study, to evangelism, is that okay for them to do? Yeah, I would think so. That's probably my line of thinking of how tomorrow morning is going to go. Can a person on a Saturday, and it doesn't matter if it's Saturday, it could be any day. The Sabbath under the New Testament is not special. It could be a Monday that you devote your day to God in service and Bible study and prayer and evangelism, right? Can a person choose Saturday to devote themselves for work for God, right? Not business work, but for spiritual work. Can they devote themselves for that? Yeah. So where would the line have to be drawn? Well, when they impose that teaching upon someone else, can they choose for themselves not to work on a Saturday so they can devote themselves to spirituality? Sure. Can they devote a Monday or a Tuesday instead? Sure they can. But the problem would be is if you begin devoting that day and telling other Christians that they need to devote that day also. There's only one day in which the Christians are called and commanded to observe, and that's the first day of the week when we come together as a church for the observance of the Lord's Supper. So that's probably my line of thinking on it. That's probably a lot more clear than what I was saying earlier. Is it okay for a person to dedicate Saturday, which is the Sabbath? Is it okay for a person to dedicate Saturday to spiritual needs? Sure. But can they devote Friday for that too? Instead of Saturday? Sure, they can. So that's probably my answer for it. So yeah, well, I appreciate y'all tuning in. This is the Bible Search Program. I got to get ready for work. I start at 8. I've been getting up early trying to do this before my wife and my son wake up. And so I appreciate everyone tuning in. I appreciate your support, your encouragement. And Jesus is the savior of his body, which is his church. He said, whoever believes and is baptized shall be saved. And those who are baptized are added to the church, which Jesus promises to save. Jesus died for your sins, right? We all fall short to God's glory. On the day of judgment, when we are judged, God has a law in which we will be examined by, and we will all fall short. But for those who are Christians, who are members of the body of Christ, who are members of the church of Christ, there is forgiveness and there is mercy available, because once you are baptized into Christ, you have faith in his death, burial, resurrection, and you choose to be baptized, you then have access to all spiritual blessings. And one of those blessings which you have access to is mercy and forgiveness that comes from God. Well, I appreciate y'all tuning in. I hope y'all have a nice rest of your day. God bless.